We've got 10 days left to make this thing work, and in fact we've got about 5 days left to find real significant revenue to ensure that the state of Oklahoma, our citizens, our kids in the public schools, our veterans in our veteran centers, those who need access to good quality care in our nursing centers and our hospitals, to make sure they don't see another year of devastating cuts to the core services that they so desperately depend upon. You know, we were here earlier this week talking about a potential budget agreement, or at least a budget revenue package that would have taken a large step in the right direction in terms of balancing this budget without hurting middle-class families. I'm sorry to say that I don't think we're any closer today to making that deal a reality, but I will say this. Our caucus, when we laid out our Restoring Oklahoma plan about 9 or 10 weeks ago now, maybe 8 or 9 weeks ago, we included as the major component of the plan increasing gross production taxes. We've said it all along that part of the reason we're in this mess is because of the series of those tax cuts to include the gross production tax giveaways to the wealthiest industry in the history of the planet. Up until the first part of this week, our caucus had met opposition on that issue at every turn. We kept being told by the Senate President Pro Tem that gross production taxes are off the table, in spite of the fact that the Speaker of the House kept saying that everything was on the table. They never would put up gross production tax for a vote. I've had meetings with the governor's office, I've discussed a few things with some Senate Republicans, and I've certainly been meeting with the House Republicans over the last number of days as we try to find a compromise. I can tell you now that there are serious conversations taking place in this building as we currently sit and stand here today, involving the gross production tax, trying to find a way to raise the gross production tax to bring in revenue as part of an overall package that would then include a cigarette tax and some other items to help raise the nearly $1 billion worth of revenue the state needs to balance the budget. Do I think an agreement will be had and hammered out tonight? Probably not. Tomorrow, maybe. But right now, as I sit here and as the citizens are waiting, hoping that there's some sort of reason to be optimistic, I can tell you now that with the speed with which the conversation has developed over gross production taxes and a few other areas, that I feel better today than I did 4 or 5 days ago, that come next Tuesday or Wednesday, we might have some real revenue packages that meet bipartisan support. And we have to do it by then, because by next Friday, any revenue-raising measure that's going to be in play for this year has to have passed out of the House and the Senate by next Friday. And so our hope is that we can, in the next 48 to 72 hours, come to some sort of agreement. And our hope is that the Republican majority will do the right thing and tell the special interest groups that have been balking at raising gross production taxes that it's time for them to come on board and do the right thing and be a part of a shared solution that doesn't raise taxes on the back of middle-class families only by raising gas taxes and cigarette prices, but actually is part of an overall solution that includes a gross production tax. And if we can get there in the next 2, 3, 4 days, I think you'll see significant revenue, and we'll see a budget pretty quick thereafter. I have been amazed over the last number of weeks at how many times I would talk to some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, in particular in the state Senate, who would look at me and say, "Oh, we're going to get this done." And I'd say, "Well, I hope so. We're going to work with you. We're going to try to get it done." And I'd say, "How are you going to get it done?" And they'd say, "We're going to do a gas tax. We're going to do a cigarette tax." And I'd say, "No, you're not." And they'd say, "Oh, yes, we are. Don't you give up on it." And I'd say, "No, you're not." I mean, I told them flat to their face, "No, you're not. You're not going to do that." And they said, "No, don't give up on it, Leader Inman. I promise you're going to get there." And I'd say, "You must be worse at math than I thought you were, right?" Because it takes 76 votes to raise the tax, the gas tax or the cigarette tax in the House of Representatives. And when it comes to the gas tax, my caucus has said all along, we will not support an increase in the gasoline prices on the backs of middle-class families so long as oil and gas production prices taxes stay low and income taxes stay where they are. And so it seemed like it just took them weeks to come to the realization that they don't have 76 votes in the House of Representatives, especially now that they have this Republican platform caucus that has been formed where 22 of them are apparently willing to thumb their nose at any real revenue-raising measures. They don't have 76. They can't get there. And in the Senate, as we see some of the revenue measures that have progressed through the Senate JCAB committee, at any given time, there are 8 to 10 Senate Republicans who are going to vote against revenue measures. And with the 2 vacancies that they have, the Senate Democrats are just as relevant as we are in the House, and they've got to work with us. And so it was up until just the last few days, I think, that they really believed in this sort of fantasy world that they could raise taxes on middle-class families, and our caucus would either go with it and go along with it and be complicit in that ridiculous idea to balance a budget, or that somehow they find some sort of magic fairy dust that would make it all happen in spite of the constitutional requirement to get a 3/4 majority. they've finally come to that realization that they need us, and when they needed us, they asked us what it would take as part of the major compromise, and it's gross production taxes. And so that's why I think they've finally come around to it.
Are we heading to a special session, do you think?
If we can find a way in the next 4 to 5 days to come to an agreement on gross production tax revenues that not just raise the gross production tax, but do it in a way that brings in significant revenue, then I think we can avoid a special session. I'll use crude math, but if you did the gross production taxes to where we want it, it brings in several $100 million. So we'll be conservative and say $200 million. You take the Republicans' numbers on cigarette tax, which if they do the right thing on gross production taxes, then we'll help them on cigarette taxes. That brings in another $200, so you're at $400 million. There's a real serious discussion about taking about $100 million out of ODOT instead of the $250 million that they'd originally talked about capping them at. Maybe taking about $100 million. That puts $500 million in the account. They're talking about doing some itemized deduction changes, exempting out charitable deductions. But if they do that, their numbers, and I'm not sure I believe them, but their numbers have that itemized deduction cap at about $100 million worth of savings. So now you're at $600 million. You've got 50 some odd million dollars worth of oil and gas credits that they've already agreed to, plus the 50 million or so of credits that they have found that was already passed off the House floor. That puts you at about $700 million. And I'm sure at that point they'll probably raid some revolving funds to the tune of $100 or $200 million, and you're getting pretty close to $900 million. And then you look at 1, 2, 3% budget cuts across the board for most agencies, and I think they get out of here without doing significant damage to those core services. I think that's how it's going to be done, if they can do the right thing on gross production. We've been negotiating gross production taxes for cigarette tax support the entire session, and we're going to stay there. We don't believe that a gasoline tax is the proper approach here. Unlike the Speaker, who said everything was on the table and then didn't mean it because he didn't put gross production taxes on the table, our caucus truly does mean it. If they come to us with a package that said that had, say our package that was going to take the income tax rate on high earners, families making over $200,000 a year, put that at 6%. Families that make over $400,000 a year, put that at 7%. That only applies to about 3% of the population. Brings in $200 million on some of the wealthiest folks. If they came to us with a package that did that, would my caucus then look at supporting a gasoline tax? Potentially. I can't speak for the caucus directly because we've not had that specific issue brought up in connection with one another. But I can tell you that we would absolutely give it serious consideration. But I just don't see them making any real movement on those high-income earners because Governor Fallon has said for all along that income tax cuts are what she believes in, and they haven't worked. But I think restoring those income tax cuts, at least at that level, is probably a non-starter. I still can't come to an understanding of where they get $900 million or $1 billion just to keep us flat, and then find an additional $51 or $52 million for a teacher pay raise. I think if we are lucky enough to find $900 million, we need to make sure that it goes in to stabilize public education before you do a pay raise. Even though my caucus has said all along that we support a pay raise, in this instance, it's sort of an odd, politics makes for strange bedfellows. When the pro tem Schultz and I are on the same page of this issue, it may seem a little weird, but I think he's right. If we find the $900 million, it needs to go to reducing class sizes before we talk about increasing teacher pay. But if we can get to $1 billion plus worth of revenue, if they do it the right way, without hurting middle-class families, and then we'd be all about giving a teacher pay increase because we desperately need one. From what I understand, the numbers that I looked at on a 6-cent per gallon increase for the gasoline prices, I think they gave me about a $200 million evaluation. So when they're talking about raising gas prices and saying, well, it's only going to, 40-some-odd% of the people who drive on the roads and are going to be paying this gas price increase are going to be out-of-state folks, maybe on the turnpike. But statewide, the vast majority of that tax increase is going to be borne by the citizens of the state, and because it's a regressive tax, it's going to be borne disproportionately by middle-class families, and that's the reason we oppose it unless they bring something like a significant income tax increase on high earners or do some other things that would help to share the burden. That's our entire goal. Is our Restoring Oklahoma plan is a solution. It doesn't just patch the gap. It raises more money to be able to invest in education and invest in teacher pay, and it shares the burden across the spectrum, not just on middle-class families. We hear some bonding proposals to pay for different buildings that may be necessary, but I believe any real legitimate discussions around bonding ODOT money or something like that are off the table, and I hope so, because you can't take out the state's credit card and put $200 or $300 million on it like they've done the last few years and think that we're going to make the state any better. Our position is this: the the gross production tax in Oklahoma, the gross production tax rate in Oklahoma is set at 7%. And we have this teaser rate for 3 years at 2%. And so our perspective is you can go from 2% to 5%, 6%, all the way up to 7% if you wanted, and it wouldn't require 76 votes. Just like they've come in and changed tax credits before. The argument there would be, yes, you're doing it for revenue for one purposes, but the other part is you're trying to level the playing field. If you're eliminating credits so that you level the playing field within the industry, because now you've got so many oil and gas producers that pay 7% and just a handful of big ones that only pay 2%, you could make the argument that what we're doing is we're just leveling the playing field. And I think that argument is one that would hold water. By asking for the gross production tax to go up, in a state that's basically the average rate is 3%, and all of our surrounding states are 8, 9, or 10%, we're not asking for some sort of crazy progressive policy. We're not asking to hurt people. We're asking for those folks who can best afford to help balance the budget, who have benefited from enormously generous cuts in the last 6 or 8 years, to pay their fair share. And so if we were asking for something that they just philosophically disagreed with as Republicans, then you could say, well, this may never happen. But at the end of the day, we're asking for something that the vast majority of the public supports, all the special interest groups support it, education, healthcare, they're all with us. The battle that we have been waging for the last 4 years on gross production taxes, and saying that it needs to increase, make no mistake about it, the House and Senate Democrats have won that battle. The battle over whether or not the gross production tax needs to increase has been won. It's just a matter of when the war is going to be won, when they're going to put it up for a floor vote, because when it is put up for a floor vote, it will pass with overwhelming support in the House with Democrats and Republicans, and the Senate the same way. So it's just a matter of the Senate leadership saying, let's just do the deal. I think that the discussion about some of the tribal gaming compact changes, I think those are still moving forward. I know Senator Schultz was a non-starter there, but it's my understanding that he shot that idea down out of hand without actually taking it to his caucus. And I think his caucus was pretty upset by the fact that he spoke for them without visiting with them. Since they've gone back to their members and discussing, my understanding is right now, as we speak, there are negotiations going on between the governor's office and House and Senate Republicans around a gaming compact change that would hopefully bring in this next year 20 to 30 million, and maybe in the next 5 or 6 years about $100 million extra a year. I don't have any issues at all with the tribal gaming changes, and I don't believe the majority of my caucus have any issues with it. But it should be noted, and we sent out a pretty strongly worded press release on Monday, and I don't usually call people a liar unless they truly did lie about what I said. The Senate President Pro Tem came out and said that it was the gaming compact changes were our ideas, were our changes, were something that we were demanding in order to get our support for a cigarette tax. Make no mistake about it. We didn't propose it. They weren't our ideas. At no point did I or anybody in my caucus say we had to have that for a cigarette tax vote. We've said all along, if the cigarette tax were to come up for a vote as a standalone issue, right? Last year our caucus was locked down because we were trying to get Insure Oklahoma expansion or something like that. We've said all along this year that our caucus is not locked down on the cigarette tax. If they want to call it up for a vote as a standalone issue, then our caucus will vote their conscience, vote their constituencies. Right now, I would argue that number in my caucus of 26, if they were to just put it on the floor for a vote, would be anywhere between 8 to something maybe like 14 members of my caucus that might vote for a cigarette tax as standalone. That's not enough to get to 26, right? They were thinking, I think the House Republicans thought, well, if they lump in this gaming part with this overall package, well, then they could use the tribal support and their lobbying efforts to say, well, now maybe this pressure will get 3 or 4 more Democrats to vote for it, and maybe 3 or 4 more Republicans to vote for it, because the tribes are saying that the tribes would insert their influence in the overall package to get them to vote for a cigarette tax. That's what they were trying to do, and so it wasn't a, if you give us this, we'll all vote for the cigarette tax. I was sorely disappointed in this Republican platform caucus of 22 apparently far-right members of the Republican Party who decided that the way we're going to balance the budget is by gutting $300 million from higher ed and taking apparently Hispanic children in the state of Oklahoma who are here at no fault of their own and punishing them. I believe that's immoral. You know, our caucus has said all along that we're the only group in the building that have offered up a true plan that funds the state, shares the burden, allows us to invest in education, healthcare, and public safety. Governor Fallon offered up her taxes on services, which was shot down, I mean, by everybody out of hand. And so since day one, we've been the only one that's offered up a plan. We've been saying, give us a plan. Well, this House Republican Platform Committee of far-right members apparently took us up on the offer, and while I appreciate them trying, the effort that they put forward would be laughable if it wasn't so offensive. They've argued that there are 22 members. I think that on any given vote, you could probably see a few of them break free and say, well, I can't stand with you. But I would hope that after what Representative Ritz said and was quoted in your articles about those children, those Hispanic children in Oklahoma City and Tulsa public schools, I would hope that many members of the caucus would step forward and denounce what he said as offensive, if not inaccurate, but as offensive as well. But it just goes to show the relevance that my caucus plays in this process. You know, the Republicans have 72 members of their caucus, but when you've got 22 of them, at least by their own admission, we've got 22 of them who are willing to come together in this far-right operation and thumb their nose at the majority and at the Speaker, then it shows that at 22, there's not even enough for them to pass a budget. They got to have 51 to pass a budget. If all 22 of them voted against the budget, they can't even pass their own budget, let alone revenue measures that require 76. And so it puts my caucus in play, and we have been all year long, all session long, saying we want to work with you. We want to work with you. Pick up the phone and call us. And finally, in the last few days, the phone's been ringing. So our caucus in our Restoring Oklahoma plan, we took about 40, I believe, of the sales taxes on services that didn't directly affect middle-class families, not doctor's visits and dentist visits and haircuts. We took all those out. But we took about 40 of them, oil field services and fur storage and limousine services and all those kinds of things that most people in Del City and around the state don't take advantage of. And we put those in as a way to say, you know what, we'll reach across the aisle. We want gross production tax or income taxes. House Republicans want cigarette tax. Governor Fallon wants some service taxes. We put it all together in an attempt to negotiate in good faith and in a bipartisan manner. And if they come to us with some of those service taxes that were in her plan, that then were mirrored in our plan, we'd absolutely help do that. To make Oklahoma state agencies who purchase things, to make them pay sales taxes on those purchases just to turn around and raise money to give it back to them, it makes no sense at all. It just shows the level of desperation that we've come to in the legislature trying to find revenue options.